So I'd like to invite back up producer Saul Papadopoulos and writer-director Terence Davies. And of course, Cynthia Nixon. And we'd also love to have Catherine Bailey, who plays Vryling Buffum, come up and join us. Oh, well, it'll take me a minute. I watched it again, so it'll take me a second to get over the experience. I start with you, Terence. You are a lover of poetry. This is your, you carry the four quartets by T.S. Eliot around with you. You practically memorized them. You can quote sonnets at the drop of a hat. But this is your first film about a poet. And I think you've made a truly poetic film, and I think that's a rare thing. It's an overused term, and it often doesn't have any meaning. This is a true poetry. Can you talk about your choice to make a film about Emily Dickinson and your love of her poetry?
Well, it really started when I was 18. I was a very lowly bookkeeper in an accountant's office, and I just read a lot. For the first year, I left school because I didn't go to university. I just read for a year. And I discovered four quartets, for instance. One week, over 4 nights, Alec Guinness read the whole of the four quartets from memory. I mean, I was knocked out by it. I didn't understand a word of it, but I sort of knew what it meant, and I went out and I bought them, and I read them now at least once a month. The sonnets I discovered when I was at drama school, because we had to prepare a poem each week, and we had to learn the sonnets, and they were a great revelation, because, I mean, had Shakespeare not written anything except the sonnets, he'd be remembered. He wrote the plays as well. It's just extraordinary. But the sonnets are, and not all of them are wonderful, and some of them are pretty boring. But the ones that are great, and they touch something deep in the human psyche of why we are here and how we live. Loss, love, all those things that we all experience, every single one of us experience, is in poetry. And although the first poems I actually learned at school, I was 10, and I learned The Highwayman by Alfred Noyes, which is a wonderful poem about a highwayman. It's a fantastic, fabulous poem, and great chunks of Hiawatha. God knows why.
Not treated well in the film. Emily doesn't like it.
But it's that octosyllabic rhyme that you cannot get out of your brain. By the shores of Gitchigumi, by the shining big sea water, stood the wigwam of Nokomis, daughter of the moon Nokomis. Behind her rose the forest, rose the black and gloomy pine trees, and on for things that go on longer than Wagner. But you can never forget.
Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere.
There you go.
It was the 18th of April, and it goes on.
Longfellow doesn't get treated well here. Anyway, so continue. And then talk about Emily Dickinson, how you came to Emily Dickinson and decided to make this film.
About 6 years ago, I began rereading the poems, because she wrote 1,808 poems, and only 7 or 11 were ever published in her lifetime. And I went back to the very first one I heard, which was Because I Could Not Stop for Death, He Kindly Stopped for Me. And I wanted to learn more about her life. And I read 6 biographies. At 6, I had to stop because I just couldn't absorb anymore. But what you do is you remember something and then you forget it. And when things come out through your subconscious, they come out refracted and changed. And that's what happened. And I just knew that it was a wonderful story because of the richness of her inner life and her spiritual struggle. And although she never comes down on, yes, there is a God, no, there isn't. She never, never despairs. There's always a little bit of hope somewhere, even in the darkest of poems. You know, parting is all we know of heaven and all we need of hell. Kiss the hills just once for me. I mean, these are wonderful lines, which I defy anybody not to cry when you read them. So it's responding to that, her genius. She's a genius.
And Cynthia, this is an extraordinary performance, truly. So I'd love to hear from both of you about the casting first, how this project started, how you became Emily Dickinson. I was saying earlier, it's so obvious now that we've watched the film. Yes, Cynthia Nixon should play Emily Dickinson, but obviously it took someone to figure out that that was the perfect match. So how did the casting come about?
Well, I had auditioned for Terence for a film that he was casting that never came off, but that's when we met. And that was some years ago. And then completely for me, out of the blue, this thing came across my desk that Terence Davies had written a biography of Emily Dickinson and wanted me to be in it. And I was completely stunned, and I read it, and I loved it. And, I think we talked by phone, and then when he came to New York, we met in person again. And I was just so thrilled and overwhelmed and really just surprised. And I just said, thank you. This is just the loveliest compliment anybody's ever paid me, just knowing it would absolutely never go anywhere. That how is he ever going to get financing for this film if it was starring me? So, but, Saul and Roy and Terence, they just kept at it year after year, and they got it together astonishingly. And so even though I was sort of steeped in Emily Dickinson from an early age, I hadn't started to research her because I thought, I'll spend all this time and then it'll never come to anything and I'll just be even more heartbroken. But finally it was really coming together. So about a few months before, I too submerged myself in a lot of biographies. And I already knew, I had read and listened to a number of her letters, in past years. And so I did that again. And I, 1,800 poems is a lot of poems, and I read as many of them as I could through all the, I read the greatest hits, and then I read, differently in every period, and then I would open them at random, and, it is amazing. We know so, particularly in the United States, we grow up on them, and we know so many of them, and then there are just ones that you come across, and that are just extraordinary, and you've never heard of them. And like I've been asked to do one for this thing on PBS called the Poetry Project, and I looked at the poem that and it's breathtaking, and I've never ever heard of it. And I think that's one of the amazing things about Emily, is because she was barely published in her lifetime, and because she was so prolific. Usually when you have a writer who writes for a long time, as she did, critics have a chance to grapple with that person's work, and they argue amongst themselves about but it's so fractured still, Emily criticism, because we're just still playing catch up, because there are so many poems, and there's such, although we know a lot about her life, there's such obscurity about, the nitty-gritty of her love life and what really went down there. And so there's just a lot of arguing among scholars.
And so how did you approach her as a character, right? Because it's still, in a sense, a fictional film. You wrote this, and it's a brilliant screenplay, by the way. You wrote this yourself, and you have the poems to go by and the biographies, but how did you approach playing Emily? It's such an incredibly internal performance.
Well, I mean, I've loved her ever since I was a kid, and I really related to her as a child, and I was, Garrison Keillor calls her the patron saint of shy persons, and I felt, when I was a young person, I really related to how much was going on inside her, and I felt like I might not look like much, but boy, if you come over here, you'd be amazed, and that's Emily, right? And then I relate to. I really relate to her.
And this is this question for you and for Catherine. the character Vryling Buffum, you can't say that name without kind of giggling.
Sounds like an anagram.
Sounds like an anagram. It's a great line. She's so integral to the first half, maybe first third, especially of the film, and it's an interesting choice because she's such an influence on her thinking, and when she disappears, you really feel like there's a loss in the film. So I'm curious. First of all, I just wanted you to talk a little bit about the character and also why you saw the first third, why she was so important to the first third of the story, and then also the approach to that character because she has an almost beautifully mechanized quality about her that is just fascinating. But whoever can start.
I guess it goes back to what Terence was saying about that sort of, even in the suffering, there's so much mischief, I suppose. There's that sort of levity, that bit of light that's in it. And I feel that Miss VB, as we were calling her, is sort of brings some of that to Emily. But I think they do have a symbiotic friendship, don't they? I think they end up, Miss VB ends up, I don't know, sort of deepening in her understanding of life and stuff like that. But certainly from the point of view of my take on the character, my reference when I met you was Olivia de Havilland in The Heiress, certainly for the accent. So I remember going into the meeting and trying to channel that, which, no pressure. But it was such fun to play. She's such a theatrical sort of character, and Terence was so generous with how you described her for me, and little additions like the fan, for example, and I got some expert tuition there on set. Thank you for that. Those things were all a gift, really. It's such a joy to play. I just feel that she adds that sort of, I don't know, mechanized is a good way of putting it, but very theatrical, I think, is how I would say.
I meant that it's a high compliment, trust me.
All right,
and can you talk a little bit about that character? She's, in discussion of the film, I feel like she might get lost. She's very important to this film.
Well, that's entirely fictional. She was actually Vinny's friend. And when I read that she was called Vryling Buffum, I thought, she's just got to be funny. But I saw a photograph of Miss Buffum when she was 40, and she looks like a sideboard. And she looks as though she hasn't heard a joke since the Civil War. But I thought, this is complete fiction. She's got to be someone who speaks her mind and doesn't care. And what she does, I think, is she fuels this rebellion. But she does it in a way that when you remember advice when it's funny, you always remember it. But even so, I mean, there are certain moments when even Miss Vryling Buff says, no, I wouldn't have done that. The plate smashing, which literally did happen. But I didn't want it to be solemn about this, poor tortured creature who never got any poems published. She was human, and they had to be alive, and I wanted them to have fun. When they're together, they're fun, and she enjoys Vryling coming over, because and this is, I suppose, autobiographical. I mean, I was brought up mostly by my sisters, and on Friday nights, my sister's friends would come round, and I was allowed to go and buy the makeup, and I can still smell Fridays. And the British northern women are really funny, and they're really fun to be around, and it was part of that as well.
Speaking of funny, don't take this the wrong way, but people who only know you through your movies, past movies, might not know that you are hysterical. You're extremely witty, very, very fast, very funny, loves to laugh, but your films wouldn't necessarily be called comedies.
No,
this film, however, for the first half, is very, very witty and funny. Could you talk about your approach to the writing of this film? Because it certainly veers grim towards the end, but there's just this amazing levity.
But I met John Waters, who's the most wonderful man. He's got the most wonderful sense of humor. And he said to me, Terence, no one does misery and death like you do. And I'm very good at it. I'm really good at it. But you've got to have a laugh as well. And if something is tragic and is preceded by a joke, it makes both. It deepens it. But I just wanted it to be funny. It's taken me a long time to write something that was funny. Because I do see the glass as half empty, not half full. But it's lovely to hear people, to make people laugh and to be made to laugh. But I didn't want it to be solemn and everybody walking around, looking as though they were constipated.
It was such a relief to get the script. I remember the first weekend we got the script, myself and Roy, my business partner, we both thought, oh my God, there goes the weekend. We've got a Terence Davies misery script about a reclusive, depressive poet, obsessed with mortality. There goes the weekend. And then we both were reading at the same time, laughing out loud, as our various partners came through and said, what are you reading? We both said, a Terence Davies script. What a relief.
And so, Cynthia, you have to play both sides of this as well. I mean, there's a lot of real wit in this movie before it becomes truly tragic. Was that a delicate balance for you in performing it?
No. I mean, I think, a lot of, some of Emily's wit just comes from how quick her mind is and how she likes to spar with people who are also quick. But of course, a lot of her humor, later on especially, but throughout, a lot of her humor comes from, as comedy often does, the gap between what is supposed to be and what actually is, and her pointing that out. And that's one of the things, when she's in, that Emily does, is her poetry, unlike much of the poetry of the period that she's from, has just fallen away because it's just so much, and Longfellow is the best of it, but just very ornamental and flowery and just rhyming for the sake of rhyming to no end. And that's the thing about Emily, is her poetry, like her letter, I mean, she's very pointed in everything she says, and her poetry is to say something, not just to sound flowery. And often what she says is, she's a critic. And so critics, unless they're really no fun, they're funny.
And can I also ask you about the poetry itself and the reading of the poetry, because it functions almost as soundtrack to the film. There's not that much
Terence,
music.
we shot this film in Belgium, and it's very hard to go to Europe. You get very sleepy and very tired. And so I think I'd been there like a day, and I came to the set kind of out of it, and I had been given a list of the poems that we were going to record, and there are, 15 of them or 20 of them, something. And Terence said, we're just going to do a scratch track because there are certain scenes that, have a poem under them, and we got to make sure that it's the right amount of, the panning around the room and takes the right time. So we just went into a random, not a sound studio, we just went into a random set, like the living room of the Dickinson's household. And, me having come off this plane, we just did a scratch track. And then he would never let me do them again. So that was kind of,
That's because they were wonderful.
But, but I love Emily's poetry, and I love, same way Terence loves poetry, I love poetry too, and I love to memorize it, and I love to recite it, and I'm a poetry buff also.
And if I may say so, because I could not stop for death, I'd always heard as rather solemn, but she read it in the most extraordinary way, in this kind of wry detachment, as though this was happening to someone else, which made it, like being punched, it's so powerful, because it goes against the meaning. That was just extraordinary. Just extraordinary.
And can I say, knowing how meticulous he is, letting you get away with something on the first try sounds very impressive to me.
Well, I mean, we did a few takes of each one. It wasn't really the first try. But
The first day, we'll say that.
the first day.
Okay, I want to open it up to the audience if people have a few questions, but I have a hard time with the lights and I can't see very well. But so just raise your hand if you have a question. Yeah, I'm sorry. Oh, yeah.
So, Terence, I love the scene where the mysterious man is walking up the stairs, and it's kind of this dreamlike scene, and I wonder how you decided to do that in lieu of exploring some of the possible romantic male or female relationships that she may have had.
The question is about the sequence of the man in black rising the staircase, and if you could talk about that a little bit and how that plays and what's the themes of that, and is it related at all to
And why
romance?
why you did that instead of a more literal exploration of her romantic.
Well, she most of that voiceover is actually hers. I added 1 or 2 lines, but she calls him the looming man, and looming in English has this kind of menace to it. And I thought, I don't want it to be literal. It has to be a kind of ecstatic need. Will he come? Will he come before I die? Please let him not forget me. I thought that it's got to be something that is outside of what would be shot literally. So we shot all of it at 48 frames. And what was extraordinary about it is that you get this sense of this deep longing for something, but which she is terrified of. It's simply by not seeing what his face is. If you don't see someone's face, it's very disconcerting, especially if you see their backs as well. That can be very disconcerting. So he should have a certain amount of menace. And I don't know where the idea came from at all, but I just knew that I wanted to use it and use 3 ravens, and put it in between this young man coming to see her, and he's really a nice lad. You know, he just wants to go out with her and have a nice time. And of course, because she is so desperate for this thing to happen, she misinterprets everything that he says, and she's at her sharpest with him because she thinks he's patronizing her, and she really doesn't like it. But he's not. He's just a nice lad. But even though it was choreographed, I said to the lad who did all the flowers, I said, could you put a display in front of this mirror? And originally it was just to track right down like this, past the mirror. And this extraordinary bouquet, which they look like the flowers of death. I said, we've got to track it on. We've just got to. So it's a dream, it's longing for this thing which she doesn't know. And she says later on, you know, I want something, but I don't know what it is, and I'm frightened of it. I mean, and God knows, you know, I mean, we've all had that.
We have time for a couple
Yes.
more.
Oh, thank God for that.
Yes. Oh, we got one here.
She's in Dublin. She wishes she was here.
Jennifer Ehle.
First of all, thank you. I mean, it's extraordinarily moving, and the performance is just, I mean, I was just indelibly just printed in my brain. But what was it like? Could you have Jennifer in mind also when you cast it from the? I know you said it was like quite a few years in the making, but when did she come into the play?
The question's about Jennifer Ehle and when was she cast? She plays the sister, and what is her involvement?
Well, in every film, I just cast one person without them reading it. I said, just, will you read it and will you do it? This was Cynthia. And I saw a lot of other people for the other roles. And I'd seen her a few years ago, again, for a film that didn't come off. And she came into the room, and I don't know how you know, but yeah, I just thought, she's right. She's Vinny. She didn't speak at this point. I said, well, will you read a scene? And we read a scene. But I just knew. You can just tell. It's as vague as that, but it's subjective. But everyone else has to read for it. But as soon as she walked into the room, I just thought, we found her. We've got her. And what was extraordinary, I did say to both of them, and I know that this was quite hard for both of them, when they row, they really go for one another. You know, the gloves are off. And I come from a large family. And when my siblings argued, I mean, it was, no quarter was given. And that's what it had to be. But what's wonderful about it is that she is always the peacemaker. She always makes up. And she always has this unbounded love for her. I mean, and there are 2, and I'm sorry you've heard this before, but I must say it again. There are 2 lines in the film that still pierce my heart. One is when Cynthia is talking to the Reverend, and she says, the line is, to be racked by success. And she says, to be racked by success. It just pierces my heart. And when she says to Jennifer, how can you go on loving me when I don't deserve it? And Jennifer just says, because you are so easy to love. Oh, that's better than acting. Better than acting.
Yes, right over here.
Well, I'd like to thank you. It was also a wonderful film. I thought it was fabulous. Now, for Cynthia, this particular part where you were shaking like violently, you took me on that ride. How would you like to see me, or was that for real?
That's all for real.
I was very not just watching you. It was fabulous, though.
That I was grateful. We didn't do a lot of takes of those. I was very grateful about that.
Very amazing. We have time for just one more, but even though I was already told to wrap it up. Yes.
Choice of music. The last piece of music, I think it's a Charles Ives piece, that over the last sequence and over the credits, it was memorably used in the Thin Red Line, Terence Davies, but I'm wondering, your motivation behind using it.
The question's about the Charles Ives piece at the end, why you chose to choose that piece of music.
Well, it actually wasn't in the script, but when I shot it, I knew that we needed something. Every 5 or 10 years, there's usually a revival of Charles Ives, because I think the symphonies are a little silly, I have to say. But the three pieces that he wrote that I think are extraordinary, as Memorial Day, it's called Decoration Day now, Sunday in the Central Park in the Dark, and what we've used, The Unanswered Question. But when we recorded it, in the first part of that piece, there are interpolations from woodwind and flute. And I said, well, what happens if we take it out? Just have the strings, nothing else. And it's almost like Shostakovich. It could be the opening of the 10th Symphony. It's this strange thing of trying to find where it is. And it was just right. I just felt it was right. But also I have a soft spot for Charles Ives because he married someone called Melody Twitchett.
Well, that's a good place to end it. Thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you.